There was a fascinating study done a couple of years ago out of Yale that showed that if we can be positive about our own aging journey, be upbeat about growing older, we can actually add as many as 7.5 years to our lifespan. It's astonishing.
Hey everyone, before diving into the episode, I want to take a moment to invite you into our mindbodygreen ecosystem, where you can explore the infinite possibilities of health and well-being. All you have to do is click the subscribe button to hear more thought-provoking interviews with leaders in the health space. I am so grateful for all of you who have tuned in over the years, and let me tell you, it's only going to get better. What are some of the common themes you found to be really interesting in your personal research of the longest living humans?
Well, I actually covered the very longest living human when I was based in Paris for AP, Jean Calment, who lived to 122 years and 164 days. And never got a one-on-one conversation with her, but covered her as she held news conferences and so forth. And I think, a takeaway with her, and you see this with centenarians and super centenarians, the oldest of us, an incredibly positive attitude. I mean, this was a woman who liked to crack jokes. At 121, she said, "I only have one wrinkle and I'm sitting on it," which is somewhat hilarious, I think, especially for that age. She said she stopped wearing mascara because she laughed so much. She was crying it off all the time. So I think we probably should, think about that a little bit. There's lots we can talk about genetics and so forth, but our attitude is absolutely critical.
Yeah, you mentioned genetics. What role do you think, obviously genetics plays a role, but what did you learn in the research of your book about the role that genetics does play in determining our fate?
Right. So the latest research into centenarians suggests that they occur roughly in 1 in 5,000, pretty much around the world. So that's just a ratio that speaks to our genetic wiring. There are those of us who've kind of, hit the genetic jackpot. That said, there are lots of behaviors that are also part of the equation. So, and that's good news for us. I don't think any of us really likes to think too much about the genetic piece. We want to be in control of our destinies and certainly of our aging journeys. But some of it's out of our control, but a lot of it is firmly within our control. So genetics accounts for about 75% of what gets us to 90. And then as you go from 90 to 100, and then thereafter, the genetics piece grows and it kind of all flips. So that by the time you're, 100, 105, the genetics piece is the predominant piece. But, you cannot live to 100 unless you've hit 90. So I think that's great news for those of us who want to live long and healthful lives.
So I'm curious on the genetics piece. Yeah, I'm sure we have listeners saying, "I'm curious if I have this gene." Offhand, do you happen to know any more detail? I know you go into it in the book about like this genetic jackpot, what that entails for those who want to dig deeper to see if they hit the longevity lottery, if you will.
There is not yet a conclusive test that you can take or some kind of blood screening. Near Barzilai at the Albert Einstein College in New York has done extensive research and has isolated what he calls a longevity gene. But so far, there's no great test available, that you can take, or a swab of your cheek or something like this, to determine, oh, I've got the gene or genes, plural, that's going to get me to 100. But you can look, there's an interesting calculator that I would encourage listeners to try out at livingto100.com. And this is a calculator developed by Tom Perls, one of the leading gerontologists in the United States. You put in your family histories and your habits, your diet, your exercise, and also whether anybody in your family has, reached these fantastic ages. And it spits out a result. For me, it gave me 102. So, kind of a shocking thing to see that on your screen.
So there are some of us that have great family histories, and many of us don't. I don't have a great family history, but I believe in the power of lifestyle modification. And so you started off with the power of joy. What other things did you learn along the way in your research that we can do today, regardless of our genetic makeup, that are going to pay huge dividends in terms of our longevity?
Right. Well, there are plentiful things. So first of all, of course, our diet. Much has been said and written about the Mediterranean diet. We see the benefits of that across the blue zones. A lot of people have followed it with great success. And, it doesn't just speak to how many years we'll live, but how healthy those years will be. So eliminating or cutting way back on red meat is something that a lot of centenarians have in common. And we know that, this is good for us. Exercise, of course, is critical, not just for our bodies, but our minds, for handling toxic stress, which is the enemy of longevity. Anything we could do to get out of a toxic stress situation will add years to our lives, full stop. In fact, it's one reason why I exited the 24-hour news cycle as a journalist for the Associated Press, because I realized as I was researching the book that I was always under enormous stress. Now I work at it in a different rhythm. So those are some things right off the bat. And then there are some other more behavioral and psychological aspects.
Let's talk about those, because I think most people get the exercise nutrition piece, and I will add that nutrition often varies for some people. Some people can't touch red meat and others can have it every day. And that's where I think that, with personalization, that's where that's going. So with regards to some of the other behaviors, let's go there.
So you mentioned joy. Centenarians whom I interviewed for the book, and many centenarians who've been studied worldwide, just seem to be joyful individuals. I guess the other side of that coin is, positivity. There was a fascinating study done a couple of years ago out of Yale that showed that if we can be positive about our own aging journey, be upbeat about growing older, and have that sort of mindset, we can actually add as many as 7.5 years to our lifespan, which is more than what you get by watching your cholesterol. And, in my case, as a marathon runner, putting in the miles and things like that. It's astonishing. There are other things that add to our lives potentially. Married people tend to live longer than single people. But scientists have been looking into this and find that it's also a phenomenon with platonic relationships. So in other words, deep friendships can give us the same benefit. That speaks to loneliness, which I know we'll talk about a little bit. So that's a thing. And faith, interestingly, seems like it adds years to our lives, potentially. And it doesn't matter whether it's Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Islam. Studies have been done that suggest that people who believe, have a religious belief, tend to live up to 5.5 years longer than people who don't. And why is that? Well, researchers are thinking that it mostly has to do with the community aspects of belief, of people gathering and hanging out together, and there's a benefit to that.
Well, that's a big thing. I think loneliness, faith. I'll segue to community, and you have a quote in the book. Let's say we're doing all the right things and we get to 80, but the fact is, and this is a quote, most people over 80 live alone. They have few people to talk with. Age lives of quiet desperation are sadly not rare. And that was quoted from another essay by sociologists in the book, I believe, that you referenced. But that's a big deal. I think where faith comes in, my view here is, if you are going to some sort of church or place of worship, that's where you're getting your community, your connection, IRL. I think there's another piece of this where faith and hope get you through adversity, like the toxic stress that we invariably all face. But let's spend a moment on that, because I think it really gets to, I think, a larger point, which you touch on the book, is the fact is technology, and we will touch on some of the technology you're talking about. Well, I'll take a step back. If lifestyle modification can only get us like so far, call it 80, 90. It's going to vary by people. That this is where technology comes in and can extend our lives, which a lot of people are very excited about and dabbling with. But then it brings back to this larger point of like the first wave. So let's say you're part of this first wave of people that are living to north of 100, but then no one else is.
Right. Yeah. It's a daunting prospect. I mean, look, loneliness is a public health crisis. The US Surgeon General has declared it such. And, it doesn't certainly only affect old people, by the way. There are millennials and Gen Z folks who are desperately lonely. But loneliness is a real problem. And the National Institute on Aging says that, being chronically lonely has adverse health effects that can actually take as many as 15 years off of our lives. And they say it's like smoking 15 cigarettes a day. That's a lot.
My second favorite stat on that, next in line with smoking, is the equivalent of 6 drinks a day. So that's 42 drinks a week.
Yeah. And there are also scientists who liken, loneliness to obesity and the adverse effects that has on our health. So it's a real problem. And, it's kind of ironic, right? Because we're more socially connected than we've ever been as a human race. And yet we are lonely, and there's no substitute for FaceTime. And I don't mean the app on your phone. I mean actual, FaceTime with another human being, the milk of human kindness, if you will. We need to deal with this. And, in the book, I kind of take a sweeping look at, whether society is ready for us to be aging in great numbers, which we are and will be. And the simple answer is no, we're not. And this loneliness question is a big one.
Yeah, and building off of the loneliness question, there's a big. It's been picked up by like every major news outlet that cancer rates are rising at an alarming pace among those who are younger. However, treatment has improved dramatically, which is great. And there are various hypotheses floating around the algorithms. In the world I inhabit, it's a lot of ultra-processed food and obesity is what's driving this. And I tend to agree that's a big part of it. But in my view, it's also loneliness. We know that this generation is very lonely, the younger generation. And I think we tend to, even though it's been essentially declared a national emergency, we still tend to discount this. When we go to a doctor, we'll do our labs, but there's not really dialogue around the social connection you're enjoying every day or lacking every day.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, when you're old, when you're very old, you have often outlived, your partner. You've outlived children in some cases, especially when we're talking about 100-somethings. Many cases, they've lived longer than their kids are gone. Their friends are gone. And, people also, it's interesting. We like to think in the United States about, what old age looks like. And for many of us, the gold standard, apart from maintaining our cognitive abilities, of course, is, living at home, aging in place. And that's all great, except that, that can leave us, again, very physically isolated when we're in a big house somewhere and, we're all by ourselves. So it's a problem. And it, the inflammation that unleashes in the body, the effects that go right down into the mitochondria in our cells, really affects all of our well-being.
Are you a fan of more urban living for longevity, in that you're walking around, you're more likely to have social interactions on a daily basis versus a rural setting where you're perhaps getting in a car to go everywhere?
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, you'll bump into more people in a city, but, people can also be desperately lonely in cities. And, they're in their little apartment and they have no contact with anyone. So it's not really just simply an answer of move to the city. We really need to just connect with each other. And I think that, all generations need to be mindful of one another. And there I see some beautiful experiments in other parts of the world where there are like intergenerational contacts that enrich the young and the old, and it's beautiful. We can take a page from their playbook.
Yes. What's an example of that?
So one that I love is in Australia. There's a program called the Centenarian Portrait Project, where high school students are meeting with 100-year-old seniors in their assisted living facilities or in their homes if they're still fortunate enough to be living independently. And the kids are sketching, sculpting, and painting their elders. And of course, during this time, there's a lot of conversation going both ways. And so you have friendships actually between 16-year-olds and 103-year-olds, and it's just lovely. Japan has a pilot program that they've been expanding where they have toddlers. They call them, I think, infant workers or something like that, which sounds a little alarming, but what it amounts to is just parents bringing their toddlers to a nursing home and letting the kids play at the feet of these very old people who are delighted. And, again, the kids get to understand a little bit more about these older people who are a curiosity. And there are stories told back and forth. And the parents, by the way, are paid with baby formula and diapers as sort of like a stipend.
I love that because I think that's a real opportunity for us here in America, where I do think ageism comes into play here. I think culturally sometimes people tend to see elders as a drain rather than a source of wisdom and experience and knowledge. I love it. I really do.
You're absolutely right about ageism. It's the most prevalent of all of the isms. We're still fighting to contain and conquer racism and sexism and all of those. But ageism seems to just rage unabated. AARP does a regular survey asking people 55 and older, 65 and older, 85 and older if they've experienced age discrimination. And the vast majority of respondents say, yes, I have. And, we live in a very youth-oriented culture where we kind of worship younger people, young bodies, younger minds. And, again, this is an area in the book that I explore. What's going to happen when we have 8 times as many 100-year-olds in 2050, just a little over 2.5 decades from now, than we do now? And what's that going to look like when we really are very youth obsessed?
What's that? I think there's a famous line from No Matter How You Feel About Reagan. It was a great line when I think he was in a debate and was challenged about his age. And he said, I won't expose my candidate's youth and inexperience or something like that.
That's right. Yeah. And of course, everyone laughed, including his opponent. And he went on to win by the biggest landslide ever seen in presidential politics.
So let's talk about retirement. And the role retirement plays in longevity. Working longer give us a better shot at living longer?
It absolutely does. We were talking earlier about, some of our psychological and mental ways of approaching aging. And purpose is a huge one. For the book, I interviewed Jane Goodall, who this year is going to turn 90. So she's still a little out from 100. But she is working like she never has before. She's working and traveling more than she did, as a young woman, working with Louis Leakey in Tanzania with the chimps. And she's got, it's palpable, her sense of purpose. Having something to get up in the morning for, a reason to live, actually adds life and vigor, mentally and physically. So, yeah, that's the other thing, though. Apart from just the psychological benefits of having purpose and maybe continuing to create and contribute well into our 90s and even into our hundreds, is that we might have to. Top of mind for many people when they consider what's a 100-year life going to look like for me is where the heck am I going to get enough money to pay a century's worth of bills? And so, it certainly doesn't, it doesn't suggest that we'll be able to, stop at 65 or some, pre-imagined age. We may well need to work into our 70s or even our 80s if we're going to be living into our hundreds like this. And that's going to be a problem for some people. I mean, for those of us who can work in air-conditioned buildings and do things that aren't physical, maybe that could work. But for many people, landscaping, construction, many, many jobs cannot reasonably be done by somebody in their 80s.
Yes, manual labor. I'm going to come back to Jane Goodall because she's an icon. How on earth did you get an interview with Jane Goodall?
I just asked. I spent 3 decades working for the Associated Press, and so I was able to approach her, and I'm just so, what a treasure she is. What an incredible hour we had together. Fantastic.
She is. I'm curious. I think she screams purpose. It's very clear she's doing exactly what she was meant and born to do. I'm curious if there are any other takeaways from what she's doing so right beyond being like squarely on purpose.
Well, she's a person of hope, and she's a prolific author as well. So, she's written a lot, and her most recent books are focusing on the power of hope and positivity. And she's an extremely positive person. She's also a person of faith. She's a scientist. She sees no inconsistency between believing in God and then trying to unravel the secrets of the universe. So she's just a really cool woman, and she's got a lot of these things going for her. She's also very, lean, and she walks a lot. She's kind of the whole package. She's kind of my, I want to be like Jane when I grow up.
I think many of us do. I want to come back to where we started with this 122-year-old woman from Paris. Joy was paramount. Like, tell us everything, what this woman was doing.
She was a fascinating individual. She took fencing lessons when she was 85 years old. That's a kind of an intense, sport to do. She was riding her bike until she turned 100. And, she eventually went into assisted living, but really kept her wits about her. She was very, very amusing. One of the stories that I covered was when she recorded a rap album at 121, which was really, it's a little she didn't strut across the stage like, but she kind of, murmured and talked along to a track and worked with some musicians. The name of the album was Time's Mistress. So she's just just a very interesting person. As I said, she was very, very funny. She once said, "I'm waiting for death and the journalists," which I thought was kind of funny. Just very sort of the queen of one-liners. She didn't have an easy life. So she also was a resilient person. She lost her husband. I think he was in his mid-40s. They were having a picnic. He ate some spoiled cherries, got botulism, and died. And so for 60, 70 years more of life, she had to do by herself. And so, yet she was able to overcome that.
Did she have children?
She had a daughter, and then she had a grandson she was very fond of. He was killed in a car accident as a young man. So again, she had sorrow, and she outlived her daughter. She outlived everyone. You don't get to 122 years and 164 days with very much company.
Well, I think that's the thing too. It's the yes, resilience plays a role, but then the pain when you're outliving, I can't even imagine parents' worst nightmare, outliving their child and then grandchild. There's a lot of pain along the way.
Yeah.
I'm curious, did she have like a routine? And I'm thinking in the very Parisian sense of, she went to the same cafe every day and sat in the same place with the same order and she held court. Like, was there anything like extraordinary or interesting about like her day-to-day routine?
Not really, except that, she was a woman of privilege. She never really had a career. She was, she was kind of, she had money and means and was able to be fairly comfortable. That's something very interesting as well, because, rich people get more time. In America, white people live longer than black people, and there are income disparities. There's a lot of inequity in this calculation. But Jean Calment did have some habits, but I wouldn't recommend them really. She smoked 2 cigarettes a day up until her, I think she was around 120, and then the doctor said, "Hey, knock it off." And she would have a glass of port wine before meals every day. Yeah, just one glass. You know, she loved chocolate.
I'm like a lot of polyphenols. Well, you eat the polyphenols and the chocolate and the wine, cigarettes. I can't help you with, but look, I think what's interesting too is it sounds like she was a curious person, because on one hand we're talking about retirements to kill her, but it sounds like this person didn't really work, had means, but like for some people who are wealthy and have means, they become very bored and have zero purpose, and they become they're miserable. And it sounds like this person was able to find purpose even though she didn't work. And I think that's interesting. So I think that's a struggle for people.
Yeah, and even at the very end of her incredibly long life, when she was, confined to a wheelchair, she wasn't mobile anymore. She basically even, lost most of her sight, and she was deaf. She was shown how to use a computer at 120 and set up a website and, started surfing the net. I mean, it's definitely a curious individual. Not something you'd expect from somebody in their 120s.
No, it's this curiosity, it's this desire to continually learn and improve. Because there are statistics, and our Dan Buettner from Blue Zones talks about this, is that I forget the exact numbers, but once you go into an assisted living home, like you're essentially like it's not looking good in terms of your longevity. So that's interesting.
Yeah. I think it just speaks to the remarkable role that our brains and our minds play in our aging journey, in our lives. We are not bags of protoplasm, with a head stuck on top. We tend to think of our organism as just that. We're a biological thing, and we divorce that from the psychological. And these things are incredibly intertwined. And so, yeah, it's being positive, being curious, having purpose, being joyful, all of these things, and of course, being in community with people. All of these things really can move the needle in terms of not just a long life, but a healthy life.
Yes. I want to come back to faith again, because I think this is one I don't think we talk about enough. Whenever I get the opportunity here, I like to go deeper on this one because we tend to discount it. We talked about the community aspect of maybe going to church or wherever your place of worship might be, or what that looks like. But you also talk about in the book, what prayer and meditation and faith can do in terms of stress relieving. Relieving stress, not stress relieving. So let's talk a bit about those benefits.
Yeah. I think those of us who have done some meditation, some prayer, quieting ourselves, breathing, and exhaling, these are things common to many faiths, and they have enormous benefits. I like to goof around in my annual physical when my doctor comes in to take my blood pressure, and I've just taken some very deep breaths and sort of centered myself, and then my blood pressure is already really low and my heart rate is low because of running, but I can make it go even lower. And then he's like, "Are you okay?" But these are the things that obviously there are aspects of our faith, if we're a believing person, that can help us with our stress. We can unload to God, and in prayer and with each other, and it makes a difference. Incidentally, there's only one blue zone in the United States, as you know, and that's Loma Linda, California, which is probably not coincidentally a base of the Seventh Day Adventist Church. And there have been studies of that group, of that cohort, and they tend to live about 10 years longer than the rest of us. And much has been said and written about their faith, and the various knock-on effects, if you will, of being together and believing, and then of course the cleaner lifestyle that generally accompanies that.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out, and something. And Dan is a great friend. He also lives in Miami, and we hang out quite often. And I would say this to Dan. I think my take on the blue zones is it's really about the faith, purpose, and connection, and the constant daily, like the daily movement. Diet, we could talk about. I think that varies. I think where the more we learn about nutrition, as I mentioned earlier, it's very personalized. Some people can eat red meat all day, others can't touch it, and that's just a variable. But those three are really paramount, and we tend not to talk about them because the science is still iffy, if you will. There's some great science around the power of faith in the brain, like people like Dr. Ellen Langer from Harvard, who we've had on the show, and some others doing some great work on that, but it's not as clear cut. And I think we all like to be in control. Tell me what my blood pressure should be, doc.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. And this is why the genetics piece of longevity, which is undeniable, unsettles us, because it's sort of like, it's like a fait accompli. It's a done deal. And some of us are tempted at that point to raise our hands in the air and go, well, shoot, either I've got good genes or I don't. And, or ill-fitting genes, as I like to say.
So you mentioned Dr. David Sinclair, who's been on the show, who goes as far as saying aging should be classified as a disease, which many people have a strong response to. I'm curious, what's your view on that statement?
It's an interesting idea. Honestly, clearly, fundamentally, he's right. I mean, everyone eventually dies of old age. I mean, if it's the Queen. I just noticed in Britain, they finally issued the death certificate or made it public for Queen Elizabeth II, and it said old age. So I mean, that was her cause of death. You can quarrel with that. I mean, I've heard a lot of doctors say that everyone actually dies of cardiac arrest, right? So ultimately
your heart gives out.
That's right. For whatever reason. But I think David Sinclair is onto something, and I think a motivation for that attitude and for that point of view that age is a disease is that maybe aging research will get more funding. I mean, there's so many millions and billions actually going to just specific diseases like Alzheimer's, which most of us will never get. Now, I applaud the research, obviously, and anyone who's had anything to do with someone who's had Alzheimer's knows what a heartbreak that can be. And we all fear that, or other kinds of dementia. But, it's well funded. What's not so well funded is just, the basics. And so I think, Sinclair is trying to get at that. If we can just, look at aging as a disease, let's get more money to see how we might be able to counter it. And we'll never probably have a cure.
So David is definitely a tinkerer, and I think what he's doing is interesting. He's leveraging pharmaceutical interventions. He's doing experiments on himself. And in the book, you talk about three emerging technologies that you think are really going to help us in the future: gene therapy, immunotherapy, and radiopharmaceuticals. Can you briefly touch on those three?
Sure. I mean, I'll start with immunotherapy. I'm 63, and in my lifetime, uh, when I heard that somebody had cancer, the whole room grew quiet. It was kind of a very often it was like pronouncing a death sentence on somebody, and that's not the case. We started our conversation by mentioning that cancers are increasing, especially in younger people. But so are cure rates. And immunotherapy activating the T cells that in our bodies to fight those cancerous cells without uh, the horrible surgery, without necessarily radiation or chemotherapy, or maybe in tandem with one or both of those. The outcomes are great. Uh, Certainly better, far vastly better than they used to be. So that's great. Gene therapy is still something that's a work in progress, but already we're seeing some results. We're able to identify defects in our genetic code and fix those things. So it's in its infancy, but it shows great promise in terms of fixing. For example, I had a friend whose father died of a massive heart attack at 45. And then as he approached 45, of course, he was really concerned. I think his grandfather had actually also died at 45. So it almost felt like the sword of Damocles. Gene therapy is trying to answer that kind of a dilemma. Do I have a gene that means, my heart's going to, uh, go into a massive arrest at 45 for some reason? Can that gene be disrupted in some way?
So I have I'm 49. My father died of heart disease at, I want to say 47, and my other grandfather, heart disease at 49. So that's like top of mind for me. And why I am very optimistic about my longevity is there's all sorts of testing you can do now. I can do extensive blood work where I can look at ApoB or LP little a to get an idea of my risk. I can do an MRI scan. There's a scan called Clearly, which is like a 3D MRI of the heart and the surrounding vessels to get an idea of the hard and soft plaque everywhere. So like I can very much, and there are other tests to find out if there's something structurally wrong, which I don't have. So it's great if you are that person, because a lot of people have family histories, whether it's heart disease, it's cancer, it's Alzheimer's. You can do a lot of testing to get ahead of it and get an understanding of your risk, and then make the necessary lifestyle modifications or pharmaceutical interventions in some cases so that you can minimize that risk as much as possible, which I think is empowering. Your genes are not your destiny to some degree. They account for a hell of a lot, but they're not your destiny.
That's right. Exactly. Of course, there's also, early detection, which is helping us immensely. And we have technology and AI to thank for some of that. Many of us have an Apple Watch that we wear around, and, those things have saved lives by detecting, changes in blood pressure, heartbeat, and heart rate, and so forth. And we can probably expect a lot more of that sort of thing. In fact, Stanford University's Center on Longevity is projecting that half of all 5-year-olds alive right now will live to 100. And they base that on these technological advances. They envision the 5-year-olds are, one of my grandsons is 5, that he'll eventually have some kind of a wearable device or a skin of some kind, even if it's just a sleeve or something that will, keep very close tabs on his vitals and transmit all of that in real time to a doctor. In terms of stroke, which is still a leading killer in the United States, I mean, this could absolutely be a game changer.
So also radiopharmaceuticals. I've heard of pharmaceuticals, but radiopharmaceuticals, not so much.
Yeah, it's kind of slow release of medicines that can alter what's going on. Attacking cancer, planting a little tiny thing right in the tumor that can can act over time. Again, avoiding drastic surgical situations, which honestly, what an awful fate that befell so many generations of people who were just carved up. And so now we have, thank God, we have some alternatives.
Yeah, look, surgery saves lives. Surgery helps repair people, but at the same time, you know, uh, I don't want to scare anyone who's getting surgery, but a lot can go wrong. There's complications, there's infection, then you're laid up, and then if you're laid up and you can't do the things you want to do, then there's the depression and mobility, you lose muscle mass, hope, and then as we all know, like getting back, once you like start to lose, like you become lonely and lose hope, it's like, oh.
Yeah, you're sort of sucked into the vortex, and everything cascades from there. So it's very, very serious. It should be avoided at all costs. The court of last resort. Right?
Yes. So I'm curious, in closing, what are the things that you've incorporated into your daily life based on all of your longevity research?
Yeah. So, well, I mentioned at the outset that I left full-time journalism. As I was researching the book, I realized that being on call all the time and having to, jump into action at a moment's notice uh, was just not good for my mental health. And I love journalism. I've been a journalist for 40 years, but it felt like it was time to, kind of break out of that and shed that toxic stress. A lot of us go around saying, "Oh, I'm so stressed out." There's a difference between, the stress is on a continuum like everything else, and some of us can kind of flippantly and glibly use that phrase. But there are people who are under real stress, and I'm thinking predominantly uh, people on the lower end of the economic scale who are wondering how to put food on the table, how to feed their kids, and pay their heating bill at the same time, working multiple jobs, things like that. So I think try anything we can do, absolutely anything we can do to reduce our stress is a win. And that's what I did, was just get out of the newsroom, and write books. you know.
And your last point regarded lower income folks, and I by no means want to minimize the real stress that people have when they're worried about putting food on the table or clothes on their children's backs or safety. I don't want to minimize that at all, but I think the interesting thing we're finding out is some of those children are happier than children in affluent, highly educated areas. That I think that's an interesting paradox. And some of the takeaways from people like Dr. Lisa Miller we've had on the show is, the relationship with the parents, how parents in those more affluent, highly educated areas have a more transactional relationship, where a lot of what the discussions around performance, it's not how are you feeling, it's how do you do on the test. I think that's interesting. I think it's sad. And I think that's something a lot of people are paying more attention to.
Yeah, well, we spent some time talking about loneliness, and in my city, in Providence, Rhode Island, uh, we have a large Latino population, and a lot of those households are multi-generational households. So you've got three generations in the same home, or a triple decker, where you've got the parents with the young kids, on one floor, and then elders on another, and people are doing life together. They're having meals together. The elders are looking after the kids so that the folks can get to work, and so forth. And in doing life like that, there's just never a dull moment. There's just a lot of life and laughter in the house, and that's a page from a playbook that we might want to consider. Again, uh, is it really great to amass wealth and then live all by ourselves in a big house on a hill where no one comes to visit us? Doesn't sound that great to me.
100% agreed. I know we've covered a lot today. Is there anything we didn't cover that you'd like to touch on before we close, or perhaps leave some words of wisdom with our audience?
I think just that, we need to be mindful that there are things we can do to affect our destiny. And, again, it's not all about living longer, but living more healthy lives. No conversation about lifespan is complete without a discussion of health span, the amount of time that we have, but we can enjoy. Yeah.
Enjoy. What's the point of being healthy if you're not having fun?
Yeah, it's about adding life to our years as much as it is about adding years to our life.
Yes, Bill, thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. May you live 100 years, Jason.
Happy 100. Happy and healthy.
Yes.